Madison Troha.
Madison Troha. $3,500. 3,500 men who are counted in Huntington, Pennsylvania during the census. But do they actually count? Growing up in Huntington, I drove past the huge brick walls with those scary spiraled wires perched above the layered fences, the locked gates, and the patrol cars that drive in circles around the building. All of these strategies meant to protect the outside community from those inside who had been convicted of crimes. I never gave thought to the community that exists within those walls. Now, after taking the Juniata Inside Out course in our local maximum security prison, I see the buildings differently, as the homes to the men who have changed my life. The fences and the wires that separate us, the gates that I pray will open for some of the men who have made the effort to change, and the patrolling cars that represent the inevitable, never-ending cycle of recidivism that many of these men face. According to Pew Research Center, almost 50% of inmates that are released end up back in prison. As studies from the Sentencing Project organization have shown, civic participation is linked to lower recidivism rates. But during incarceration, felons lose the right to vote. Voting is a right of citizens and is independent of the crime they committed. Now, I know this might sound radical, but I invite you to consider the evidence as to why it is essential to give everyone, even those imprisoned, a right to vote. I argue that acknowledging voting rights of incarcerated citizens would remind us all of our shared humanity, leading to the possibility of real reform to the American prison system. Doing this would require that we recognize the racial disparities of prisons and in society, and reinforce our civility by investing in education for inmates, and remind ourselves and the inmates of our shared humanity. Their voice and their lives should count too. So let's talk about disparities. Many of my Inside classmates in the Inside Out course are the epitome of being dealt an unfair hand in life. They grew up in poverty and with access to very few, if any, resources. Similar to the representation in my Inside Out course, the American prison system is primarily made up of racial minorities. Even though there's little statistical difference in African Americans and white Americans actually committing the crimes, according to the NAACP, African Americans are incarcerated at more than 5 times the rate of white Americans. And although African Americans and Hispanics make up approximately a third of the U.S. population, in 2015, they unfairly comprised over half of all incarcerated people. Due to this high percentage, disenfranchisement has the greatest impact on minorities, ultimately preventing significant voices from being heard and counted. Rather than eliminating their voice, we would be a stronger nation if our political system allowed the voices of the disenfranchised to express their perspectives from the inside. So how can we address disparity and reduce recidivism? We can reinforce civility by educating the incarcerated and preparing them for citizenship. As human beings, we spend most of our lives searching for a purpose and a reason to be alive, both inside and out. Although yes, we can all educate ourselves simply for the purpose of gaining knowledge, but we also instinctively educate ourselves to have a purpose and to feel useful in society. In 2019, an Atlantic article argued, if people in prison had the right to participate in the political process, legislators would view them as a real voting bloc, and therefore conditions of confinement would improve, the justice systems would change, and prisons might even begin to close. Voting would also help people feel connected to society and value their communities. As stated recently by the Hamilton Project, the United States spends nearly $81 billion per year on corrections. This spending is increasing at triple the rate of spending on public education. So if we're going to invest all of this money on rehabilitation efforts for those inside, and according to the Bureau of Justice, 95% of inmates will be released, this means that we should give them the rights and opportunities to utilize those tools once they re-enter their communities. Radical or not, Maine and Vermont are already doing it. In these states, felons never lose their voting rights, even during incarceration. If more states don't give incarcerated citizens the same civic rights as the rest of us, we are only feeding the injustice of disparity and the vicious cycle of recidivism. In the fall semester of 2018, I took an Inside Out course in SCI Smithfield with 10 incarcerated men, 9 other Juniata students, and 1 Juniata professor. It was a transformative learning experience that gave me a new perspective on humanity and a reason to advocate for the rights of everyone, especially the rights that give us the ability to make a difference. During the semester, I witnessed the impact that 10 incarcerated men had on Juniata students, especially myself. One of my incarcerated classmates wrote in his reflection, "In an inhumane environment, every Wednesday, I felt a little more human." Like education, voting is a simple action that reminds us of our connection to humanity, of our place in society. It reminds us that we all have a voice that should count. Supreme Court Justice Thurgood Marshall once said, "When the prison gates slam behind an inmate, he does not lose his human quality. His mind does not become closed to ideas. His yearning for self-respect does not end, nor is his quest for self-realization concluded." Now, while this is most definitely true, what he does lose, however, is his right to exercise these qualities. Acknowledging voting rights of citizens reminds us of our common ground, of our shared humanity. It allows us to recognize the racial disparities, and it motivates us to reinforce civility by investing in education. Students, I challenge you to take an Inside Out course and allow the experience to transform you. When you witness the true potential of a room full of students who are all treated as humans for those 2.5 hours each week. Finally, I encourage you to be counted. Do not waste your right to vote, but consider this issue of prison reform when choosing candidates for the upcoming presidential election. I challenge you to vote on behalf of the voices that aren't heard. All of us here in this community are counted on the census, no matter what side of the barbed wire we are on. If we are eventually going to invite the majority of incarcerated citizens back into our communities, we must empower them to participate by giving every citizen a voice that counts.